The third bend of the river on the Central Plains lay perhaps 11 miles east of the small territorial village of Taliford, on the wagon road that ran from Taliford to the county seat at the eastern foothills. In a curve of the river that came down between two low grassy banks, and that was, in May of most years, a low shallow ford of perhaps 3 feet of clear cold water that any farm wagon of the territory could cross at a slow, careful pace. It had been raining heavily for 4 days in the eastern foothills in the second week of May of 1854. The river had risen, by the morning of the 14th, to perhaps 8 feet of dark, fast water at the third bend, with a current pushing 6 knots, with the pebbled bottom now entirely invisible beneath the dark surface, and with a thin spume of yellow froth marking the standing wave at the center of the ford that had not been there at 6 o'clock the previous evening. A small farm wagon of the Central Plains, pulled by a single small gray draft mare with a heavy canvas hood pulled forward against the spring sun, with a small wooden trunk and a single canvas bag of household goods lashed to the wagon bed, with 3 figures on the wagon bench, had come down the wagon road from the west at 20 minutes past 9 on the morning of the 14th. The 2 adult figures on the wagon bench were Aldred Marrow of Manchester, England, 34 years old, a small, lean, weathered man with a short dark beard and pale gray eyes, wearing a brown wool coat over a white linen shirt and dark trousers and a wide-brimmed brown felt hat, and his wife, Beatrice Marrow, of the same Manchester, 31 years old, a small, slim, weathered woman with dark brown hair pinned under a small dark wool bonnet and kind, pale brown eyes, wearing a long-sleeved dark blue wool dress with a clean white linen apron. The third figure on the bench between them was their only son, Edmund Marrow, 7 years old, born in Manchester on the 3rd of February in 1847. A small, bright-eyed boy with dark brown hair cut short across his forehead, and his father's pale gray eyes, wearing a small navy blue wool coat over a clean white linen shirt, with his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. The Marrow family had crossed in the second wave of the English emigration in the summer of 1852, and had taken a leasehold of 40 acres in the Central Plains 19 miles west of Taliford in the spring of 1853, and had been planning on the morning of the 14th of May in 1854 to ride east to the county seat for the wedding of Beatrice's cousin Mary Bell to a Methodist farmer named John Penrose, for which Beatrice had been mending a small, clean white linen handkerchief in her lap as the wagon had come down the wagon road. Aldred had been driving. He had reined the gray mare to a stop perhaps 20 feet back from the river. He had looked at the dark, fast water. In the small, careful voice he used when he was thinking through a problem that required some immediate decision, he had said, "Beatrice, the ford is up." Beatrice had set down the handkerchief. The ford had been a low, clear 3 feet of water for the previous 9 days, and the freighters from the eastern foothills had been crossing it twice a day, and Aldred had crossed it himself 3 times in the previous month at the same pace at which he had been driving the wagon that morning, and there had been no warning in his preparations or in his planning that the river was going to be up to 8 feet in deep, fast water at the third bend on the morning of the 14th. He had thought, for perhaps 30 seconds, with the small gray mare standing patient on the bank, about whether to turn back and ride the longer 26-mile road to the southern crossing at Cobb's Ferry. He had decided against it because the wedding was on the Saturday, and they were already going to arrive late. And because he had judged in the manner of a man with 2 years of Central Plains farming under his belt, that he could read fast water, and that the wagon could hold the line of the ford if he kept the gray mare straight. He had said, "Beatrice, hold the boy." He had clucked once at the gray mare. The wagon had moved forward into the water. The gray mare had taken the first 6 steps without trouble, the water at her hocks, then at her belly, and at the 7th step the current had taken the wagon tongue sideways, and the gray mare had felt the pull on her harness and had tried to step against it, and her right hind foot had slipped on the slick stone of the deeper bend, and she had gone down on her right hip in the water, and the wagon tongue had snapped at the swingle tree, and the wagon had turned broadside to the current in the precise instant of 3 seconds, and the canvas hood and the small wooden trunk and the single canvas bag of household goods and all 3 of the Merrow family had gone into the dark, fast water of the third bend. Aldred had been pulled under the overturning wagon. He had been pinned by the wooden frame across his chest in 3 feet of water that was still 6 feet below the surface, and he had not been able to free himself, and he had drowned within perhaps 100 seconds. Beatrice had been thrown clear of the wagon. She had come up perhaps 6 feet downstream of the overturned wagon in the middle of the fast water of the ford, with her dark blue wool dress now heavy with water and pulling her down, and she had seen Edmund in the water to her right, perhaps 12 feet farther downstream, with his small dark head just visible above the surface. And she had struck out swimming toward him in the way a woman who has not swum in 11 years swims, and she had reached him with her right hand and had touched his small shoulder for the length of perhaps a second, and the current had then taken her own dress under her and had pulled her down, and her right hand had slipped from his shoulder. She had drowned in the dark water at the bottom of the third bend within perhaps 2 minutes of touching her son for the last time. Edmund Merrow had been carried downstream by the current of the third bend of the river. He had been struck twice by hidden rocks in the dark water, once on his right shoulder, once on the back of his head, and he had been turning slowly in the current, sometimes face up and sometimes face down, and he had been carried 1/4 of a mile downstream of the ford, and he had been losing consciousness in the cold of the water by the time the current had pushed him into the shallow eddy at the bottom of the third bend, where a small projecting stone had caught the wool of his small navy blue coat at the right shoulder and had held him with his face perhaps an inch above the dark surface for the length of perhaps 40 seconds. An Orc woman of perhaps the middle generation of the Central Plains, who had been walking the riverbank at the bottom of the third bend that morning, in the cool, clear light of mid-morning, on her way south from a summer camp she had kept the previous month in the eastern foothills, who had heard the splash of the overturning wagon 1/4 of a mile upstream, and had begun to run along the bank toward the sound, had reached the eddy at the bottom of the third bend at the precise moment Edmund's small navy blue coat had caught on the projecting stone. She had set down her small canvas pack and her tall walking staff on the dry grass. She had stepped into the cold water of the eddy to her waist. She had reached out with both her green painted arms. She had taken Edmund Merrow by the back of his small navy blue coat and by the back of his small dark-haired head, and she had lifted him out of the water, and she had carried him in both her arms back to the dry grass of the riverbank, and she had set him down on his side on the grass with his face turned toward the river, and she had pressed twice on his small chest with both her green-painted hands, and he had coughed once, and then twice, and then he had vomited perhaps a cupful of dark river water onto the grass, and he had coughed a great deal more, and his small eyes had opened. The Orc woman had been kneeling beside him on the grass. She had said, in the public language, in a low, warm voice that was clear in the cool morning air, "Little one," she had said, "can you hear me?" Edmund Merrow had looked up at her face. He had seen the bright, vivid, emerald-green skin of an adult Orc woman of perhaps the middle generation, with two long black braids tied back behind her head with a thin leather cord, with two small lower tusks, with large, prominent, pointed elf-like ears, with dark eyes that were fixed steady on his own pale gray eyes. He had said, in a small, wet voice, "Ma'am." The Orc woman had said, "Little one, I am going to build a fire on the dry grass, and I am going to wrap you in my coat, and we are going to wait here on the riverbank until you can stand up on your own feet." She had taken off her heavy brown wool traveling coat and had wrapped it around his small body, and she had carried him perhaps 100 yards further from the river to a small patch of dry grass between two large flat stones that broke the wind from the south, and she had laid him down with the coat around him, and she had walked back to the riverbank to collect her small canvas pack and her tall walking staff, and she had built a small, careful fire on the dry grass with 3 pieces of small dry wood from her pack and a single strike of a flint, and the warm orange of the flame had begun to dry the soaked navy blue of Edmund's small wool coat. He had been crying quietly. She had been sitting beside him on the grass with her right hand resting carefully on his small shoulder. She had said, "Little one, the wagon that came across the ford this morning was yours?" He had said, "Ma'am, yes." She had said, "The man and the woman were your father and your mother?" He had said, "Ma'am, yes." She had said, "Your father and your mother did not come up out of the water." He had said, in a smaller voice, "Ma'am, no." She had said, "Little one, what is your name?" He had said, in a voice that was clearer than the smaller one, "My name is Edmund Merrow, ma'am. I am 7 years old." The Orc woman had said, "Edmund." She had said, "My name is Thessa of the River Peak Band." He had said, "Thessa." She had said, "Edmund, please rest." He had rested. She had built the fire higher. She had warmed a small amount of dried meat from her pack over the flame, and had broken it into small pieces, and had fed it to him slowly across the next half hour. And she had given him water from the small leather flask at her belt, and she had spoken to him quietly about ordinary things, about the small dark birds that had been flying along the riverbank, about the wind that had been coming from the south, about the way the small flat stones beside the fire collected heat that would warm him through the next several hours, about the small herd of pronghorn she had seen the previous afternoon 10 miles north of where they were sitting. She had not asked him about his parents again. He had begun, by perhaps the 3rd quarter of an hour beside the fire, to grow drowsy. She had seen this. She had said, "Edmund?" He had said, "Ma'am." She had said, "Little one, you are going to live a very long time, and you are going to do many things, and the river did not get to keep you." He had looked up at her face for a long moment. He had said, "Ma'am, yes." She had said, "Please, sleep." He had slept. She had sat beside him on the grass for perhaps an hour, with her right hand resting on his small shoulder, watching the small, careful rise and fall of his breath, and then she had risen carefully from the grass. and she had folded a small piece of cured deer skin from her pack and had placed it under his small dark head as a pillow. And she had laid her heavy brown wool traveling coat over him from his shoulders to his feet, and she had set a small handful of dried meat in a piece of clean linen at his side, and she had laid her own tall walking staff across his legs so that he would not roll into the embers, and she had stood for perhaps 30 seconds, looking down at the sleeping boy. She had then walked into the small line of cottonwoods at the south edge of the grass, and she had gone, and the grass behind her had not bent. Edmund Merrow had slept for perhaps 3 hours. He had been found at the small patch of dry grass between the two stones at 20 minutes past 2 o'clock that afternoon by a passing freighter named Hosea Crooks, who had stopped at the third bend to water his team, and had seen the overturned wagon in the river and had ridden the quarter-mile downstream looking for survivors. He had found the small dark-haired boy asleep under a heavy brown wool coat with a tall walking staff across his legs. He had lifted the staff carefully. He had lifted the wool coat. He had spoken to the boy. The boy had opened his eyes. In a small voice, the boy had said, "Ma'am." Hosea Crooks had said, "Child, my name is Hosea Crooks, and I am not a ma'am. Child, where is the woman who left you here?" Edmund Merrow had looked around himself at the small patch of dry grass between the two stones, and at the burned-down embers of the fire, and at the wool coat over him, and at the staff that had been across his legs. He had said, in the same small voice, "Sir, I do not know." Hosea Crooks had said, "Child, what is the name of the woman who left you here?" Edmund Merrow had looked up at Hosea Crooks. He had tried to remember. He had thought for perhaps the length of 15 seconds, with his small face caught in the precise, puzzled attention of a 7-year-old child who had been told a name once on the riverbank, at the moment of greatest shock of his life, and who had been entirely sure he was going to remember it. He had said, in a smaller voice, "Sir, I do not remember." He had said, "Sir, the name began with the sound th, or perhaps with the sound s, and I cannot remember which one." Hosea Crooks had said, "Child, please stand up." He had stood up. The wool coat had fallen from his shoulders. Hosea Crooks had picked up the coat and had wrapped it around the boy. He had carried both the coat and the staff, and the small folded piece of cured deerskin, and the small handful of dried meat, and the boy back to his wagon, and had ridden the 11 miles to Taliford with the boy on the wagon bench beside him, and he had delivered the boy to the small Methodist church at the village, and the minister, the Reverend Hollins, had sent a telegram that afternoon to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to the address of Cyrus Merrow Penrose, brother to Beatrice Merrow, asking him to come west and collect his sister's son. Cyrus had arrived by train at Taliford on the evening of the 20th of May in 1854. He had collected his nephew. He had ridden the train east with him to the prosperous farm near Lancaster, where Cyrus and his wife Hannah had been raising their own 4 children for the previous 11 years, and they had taken in Edmund Merrow as their 5th child, and had raised him at the farm for the next 13 years. Edmund had brought with him from the Central Plains the small folded piece of cured deerskin and the small handful of dried meat in its piece of clean linen, and the heavy brown wool traveling coat and the tall walking staff. The dried meat he had eaten on the train east. The piece of clean linen he had kept in his pocket. The wool coat he had grown into across the next 8 years and had worn until 1862, when at 15 He had finally outgrown it and had put it away in the small wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. The walking staff he had kept under his bed, the small folded piece of cured deerskin he had kept under his pillow every night of the next 65 years. Edmund Merrow had grown up at the Merrow-Penrose farm in Lancaster County in the careful, kind keeping of his maternal Aunt Hannah and his Uncle Cyrus, alongside his 4 older cousins. He had been a quiet boy and a careful student at the small friends' school the family had sent him to in 1855. He had asked his Aunt Hannah at the age of 9 whether there were any Orc women named Thessa in Lancaster County. There had been none. He had asked her at the age of 10 whether there were any in the eastern counties of Pennsylvania. There had been 3, and Hannah had written to each, and none of the 3 had been at the third bend of the river on the 14th of May in 1854. He had taken over the small wooden box at the foot of his bed at the age of 13 in 1860, and had transferred to it the small folded piece of cured deerskin from under his pillow, and the small piece of clean linen the dried meat had been wrapped in, and the small bundle of letters Hannah had written to the 3 Thessa settlements, with their kind, careful replies. The Merrow-Penrose family had lost 1 son, Cyrus's eldest, Joseph, to the war in the spring of 1863. Edmund had been 16, not old enough to enlist before the war had ended in 1865, and he had not enlisted in the brief campaigns of 1866 and 1867 against the Orc clans of the eastern foothills, because he had not been able to imagine raising a rifle against the people of the woman who had pulled him out of the river. He had told Cyrus this at the age of 19 in the front parlor of the farmhouse. Cyrus had nodded once. The matter had not been raised again. Edmund had come into the inheritance of his birth parents' leasehold on his 21st birthday on the 3rd of February in 1868. The leasehold had been sold by Cyrus on Edmund's behalf in the autumn of 1854 to a neighboring farmer named Brand, and the proceeds had been held in trust in the Lancaster Savings Institution, growing by the careful management of Cyrus to perhaps $1,140 by Edmund's 21st birthday. Edmund had withdrawn the entire sum on the 7th of February in 1868. He had ridden the train west on the 17th of February. He had reached Taliford on the 3rd of March. He had ridden out the 11 miles to the third bend of the river on the 4th of March, in the cold, pale light of an early spring afternoon, and he had stood on the dry grass between the 2 large flat stones where she had built the fire 14 years before, and he had taken from his pocket the small folded piece of cured deerskin, and had held it in his right hand for perhaps 20 minutes, and he had walked back to the wagon road in the warm gold hour of late afternoon. He had bought a quarter section of 160 acres of Central Plains country 2 miles south of the third bend on the 11th of March in 1868, with $800 of the inheritance, from a freighter who was leaving the territory. He had put up a small wooden cabin on the quarter section in the spring of 1868 with the remaining inheritance and the help of 2 hired men from Taliford. He had broken the first sod of his own farm in the summer of 1868. He had posted his first notice at the small territorial mercantile at Taliford on the 17th of May in 1868, 3 days after the 14th anniversary of the rescue, on a small piece of clean white linen paper in his own careful schoolroom handwriting, which read that he was seeking an adult Orc woman who had been traveling alone in the spring of 1854 with a small scar on the back of her right hand in the shape of a fishhook, who had pulled a child out of the river at the third bend on the 14th of May, that the child was now 21 and would like to thank her, that any Orc woman of any clan or band who knew the woman in question was kindly asked to write to Mr. Edmund Merrow at the Taliford post office, and that there was no reward and no obligation. He had posted similar notices at every territorial mercantile within 100 miles of his farm in the next 4 years. He had received the first reply in the autumn of 1868 from a Methodist farmer's wife in the eastern foothills who had known an Orc woman named Thessa 20 years before, who had been at the Orc settlement at Gray Peak Hollow at the time of the rescue and had not been within 50 miles of the river. He had received the second reply in the spring of 1869 from an Orc man named Veth of the White Fork clan, who had written that he had a sister named Thessa who had been working at the White Fork settlement on the Western Branch Road on the 14th of May of 1854 with no scar of any kind on the back of either of her hands. He had received 40 further replies across the next 4 decades, none of which had been her. The Eastern campaigns had run from the autumn of 1871 through the summer of 1878. Edmund had not been able to ride to the Eastern Orc settlements during those years, and he had farmed his quarter section quietly, and had attended the small Methodist church at Taliford, and had walked the 11 miles to the third bend of the river every 14th of May regardless of weather, and he had laid a small handful of wildflowers on the dry grass between the 2 large flat stones, and he had sat on the grass for an hour, and he had spoken aloud to no one in particular the sentence she had spoken to him on the riverbank, and which he had repeated to himself every 14th of May since. "Little one, you are going to live a very long time, and you are going to do many things, and the river did not get to keep you." He had then walked back to his quarter section. The campaigns had settled in the summer of 1878. He had ridden east in the autumn of 1879 to the 3 principal Orc settlements on the Third River: Gray Peak Hollow, the new White Fork settlement north of the old one, and a smaller settlement of the displaced Marrowstone clan. And the elders of each settlement had taken down his description carefully in writing in the leather-bound clan records, and none of the 3 settlements had recognized the woman he was looking for. He had ridden home. He had met Henrietta Bell at the small Methodist church at Taliford on a Sunday morning in the spring of 1882, when he had been 35 and she had been 31. Henrietta was a Quaker schoolteacher from Lancaster County who had come west with her widowed mother to keep house and to teach at the small school at Taliford. She had known Edmund's cousin Mary Bell Penrose in Lancaster, the same Mary Bell whose wedding the Merrow family had been riding to on the 14th of May in 1854. Henrietta had not raised this connection with Edmund at the church. She had raised it with him on the 3rd Sunday of their acquaintance at the small Methodist church coffee after the service. Edmund had nodded once. "Henrietta," he had said, "please come to supper at the farm on the following Sunday afternoon." She had come. They had married on the 11th of October in 1882. They had raised 3 children at the farm: Thomas, born in 1884, Martha, born in 1887, and a 3rd son who had died in his 2nd week of life in the spring of 1890. Henrietta had been patient with Edmund's May 14th ritual every year of their marriage. She had walked the 11 miles to the third bend of the river with him in 1883 and 1884, and had sat on the dry grass between the two large flat stones with him in silence for the hour, and she had stopped going with him in 1885 when Thomas was born, and she had stayed at the farm with the children, and she had not asked Edmund on any of those 33 anniversaries to stop. He had not stopped. He had written, in the summer of 1893, at the age of 46, a long, careful letter to the territorial historian at the Capitol, a man named Theodore Marsh, who had been compiling oral histories of the pre-campaigns period for the previous 11 years. Theodore Marsh had written back in the autumn of 1893 with 3 possible names: Thesari of the Cold Fern, Thesana of the Gray Peak, and a woman known to her people only by the descriptive name the Long Walker, who had been a solo traveler in the Central Plains in the early 1850s, and who had been a River Peak woman of the old band that had been absorbed into Gray Peak and White Fork during the campaigns. Edmund had written to all 3. Thesari had been 74 in 1893, and had been at her settlement in the central foothills on the 14th of May in 1854, weaving a child's blanket for a great-granddaughter, with 2 surviving witnesses. Thesana had been 58 and had been at the Gray Peak settlement on the same day with 3 surviving witnesses. The Long Walker had been described by the elder who had answered Edmund's letter as a woman who had not been seen by any of the people who remembered her since the autumn of 1855, and who had been presumed dead in the campaigns. Edmund had written back to thank the elder. He had not written further. He had continued the May 14th ritual every year. Thomas had taken over the farm in the spring of 1907 when Edmund had been 60. Edmund and Henrietta had moved into the small front room of the farmhouse. Edmund had continued to walk the 11 miles to the third bend of the river every 14th of May, regardless of weather. Henrietta had died of a slow heart trouble in the autumn of 1908. Edmund had been 61. He had buried her in the small Methodist plot at Taliford. He had continued to walk to the river every 14th of May. Thomas had married Sarah Lindley in the spring of 1909. Sarah was a midwife of the Central Plains, who had trained at a Quaker hospital in Philadelphia in her late 20s, and who had come west in 1908 to a small medical practice that had taken her to small farms and small orc settlements across 3 counties for the next 7 years before her marriage. She had continued her practice after the marriage. She had been called out to a small orc settlement 2 days' ride east-southeast of the farm on the 2nd of June in 1916 for a difficult delivery of an orc woman in her 3rd pregnancy who had lost the previous 2. Sarah had ridden the 2 days east with her medical bag and her own small gray mare. She had spent 2 days at the settlement attending the delivery, which had been long and which had been successful, and she had spent the 3rd evening at the small wooden table of the elder cabin drinking tea with the senior elder of the settlement, an orc woman of perhaps 98 years named Thessa, who had been the principal healer of the settlement for the previous 70 years. Thessa had asked Sarah about her family, and Sarah had told her of Thomas, her husband, and of Thomas's mother, who had passed 8 years before, and of Thomas's father, Edmund Marrow, who was now 69, and who had been a quiet, kind man all of Sarah's 7 years of acquaintance with him, and who had a small ritual every May 14th of walking to the third bend of the river south of Taliford and sitting for an hour on the grass alone. Thessa had set down her cup. "Daughter," she had said, "the man you have just described as your husband's father was 7 years old at the third bend of the river on the 14th of May in 1854. Sarah had said, "Ma'am." Thessa had said, "Daughter, please ride home tomorrow morning and tell him that the woman who pulled him from the river that day is sitting in a small cabin at the eastern edge of this settlement, and that she has remembered him for 64 years, and that she would like very much to see him before she dies." Sarah had ridden home the next morning. She had reached the farm at the warm gold hour of late afternoon of the 6th of June in 1916. She had told Edmund in the kitchen of the farmhouse what Thessa had said. Edmund had set down the small cup of coffee he had been holding. He had walked the 4 paces to the wooden coat peg beside the front door. He had taken down his brown wool work coat and his wide-brimmed brown felt hat. He had taken the small wooden box from the small wooden side table beside his own bed. He had taken from the box the small folded piece of cured deerskin and had put it carefully in the inside breast pocket of his coat. He had saddled his own small gray mare. He had ridden east on the wagon road within the hour. He had reached the Orc settlement at the warm gold hour of late afternoon of the 8th of June in 1916, after riding 2.5 days east-southeast across the Central Plains. The senior elder of the settlement, a tall, thin Orc man of perhaps 70 years who had come out to meet him at the wagon road, had walked him to a small wooden cabin at the eastern edge of the settlement, and had stopped at the doorway and had said in the public language, "Mr. Marrow, Mr. Marrow," the senior elder had said, "please go in." Edmund had walked through the open doorway of the small cabin into the warm yellow lamplight of a single brass oil lamp on a small wooden table. Sitting in a wooden chair beside the table was an Orc woman of perhaps the senior generation, with her bright, vivid, emerald green skin now thin and lined at the cheekbones, with her long black hair now fully white and tied back in the older 2-braid pattern of the River Peak band, with a single thin leather cord at each braid, with 2 small lower tusks, with large, prominent, pointed, elf-like ears, with dark eyes that were watery now with age, but that were fixed steady on his face. She had been waiting. She had said, in the same low, warm voice that she had used on the riverbank 64 years before, "Edmund." Edmund Marrow had said, in the voice of a man of 69, who had been waiting 64 years to be allowed to say a single word, "Thessa." He had walked the 3 paces from the doorway to the small wooden chair across the table from her. He had sat. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "Edmund, please give me your right hand." He had given her his right hand. She had taken his right hand in both her own green-painted hands, and she had turned her own right hand palm up between his fingers, and she had shown him the small scar on the back of her right hand in the shape of a fishhook, which was now faded by 64 further years of weather and work, but still entirely the same shape he had seen on the riverbank 64 years before. He had said, "Thessa." She had said, "Edmund." He had said, "Ma'am, may I ask you a question I have been waiting to ask for 64 years?" She had said, "Please." He had said, "Ma'am, what did you say to me on the riverbank that day?" She had looked at him across the small wooden table. She had said, in the same low, warm voice she had used 64 years before, "Little one, you're going to live a very long time, and you're going to do many things, and the river did not get to keep you." He had wept, quietly, with his right hand still in both her green-painted hands for the length of perhaps 3 minutes. She had waited. He had stopped. He had said, "Thessa." She had said, "Edmund." He had said, "Ma'am, thank you." They had sat together in the warm, yellow lamp-lit cabin for the rest of the afternoon, and they had spoken of small, ordinary things, of the small, dark birds on the riverbank, of the wind that came from the south, of the way the small flat stones beside the fire had held the heat, and of the small herd of pronghorn that Thessa had seen on the day before the rescue 10 miles north of where they had built the fire. They had not spoken of his parents. They had eaten supper together at the small wooden table at sundown, of a stew that the senior elder's wife had brought to the cabin. Edmund had slept that night on a small bedroll on the wooden floor of Thessa's cabin. He had returned the next morning for 2 more days. He had ridden home on the 11th of June. Thessa of the River Peak Band had died in her own small cabin at the Ork settlement on the 14th of November in 1918 at the age of 99, 6 months after Edmund's visit. The senior elder of the settlement had written to Edmund. Edmund had ridden east in the cold, pale gray light of the late autumn and had been at the burial on the 17th of November. He had not walked to the third bend of the river on the following 14th of May in 1919. He had died in his own bed in the small front room of the farmhouse on the 8th of April in 1919 at the age of 72, with Thomas and Sarah and Martha and the small wooden box at the bedside table beside him. He was buried beside Henrietta in the small Methodist plot at Taliford. The small wooden box at the bedside table had passed to Thomas, who had kept it on his own bedside table for the remaining 31 years of his life, and to Sarah after Thomas's death in 1950, and to Sarah's daughter, who had donated the small folded piece of cured deerskin and the small piece of clean linen and the small bundle of letters and the heavy brown wool traveling coat and the tall walking staff to the small county historical society at Taliford in the autumn of 1971. The deerskin and the linen and the letters and the coat and the staff are held in the present day at the Historical Society in a glass case at the back of the second floor of the building, beside a small printed card that reads, in the careful, even hand lettering of a volunteer curator, the single sentence that Thessa of the River Peak Band spoke to Edmund Merrow on the riverbank on the 14th of May in 1854, and that Edmund Merrow repeated to himself every 14th of May for the next 64 years. Little one, you are going to live a very long time, and you are going to do many things, and the river did not get to keep you. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Ork Keeper.